Oh. Good afternoon and welcome to yet another dialogue on this incredible series of creative exchange where we look to understand processes and design solutions to some of the everyday challenges we're facing in South Africa, on the continent, and indeed the world. Today's question is an ambitious one. How do we find design solutions to obviously meet the challenges that are faced by the environment right now and have those solutions ensure your well-being and your health and welfare? I've got a wonderful, wonderful panel of guests who are brave enough to tackle this topic, and we're hoping you're going to join us on this journey for the next hour and a half or so. My name is Africa Malane, and it is my joy and pleasure to be hosting this dialogue once again as we build, of course, to the Co-Create Design Festival, which will be hosted in September, and we'll share some details with you towards the end of the day. We find ourselves in challenging times. Stage 6 is looming in 2 hours in the majority of South Africa, and we certainly appreciate that you might not be able to stay with us the duration of this conversation, but it will be made available, of course, on social media platforms, and we ask that if you know colleagues, friends, people in the space who should be listening to this conversation, that you share it with them as widely as possible. And if anyone is from Eskom, please find a solution. We really cannot deal with it anymore. It's enough. The last time we had stage 6 was December of 2019, and I was hoping and praying we'll never find ourselves in that situation again. And I bring it up because the stress that is brought on general society by the fact that, I don't know, they don't know how they're going to heat up their child's bottle, for example, to feed them. There are people with health concerns who need nebulizers and all sort of machinery to be operating 24 hours a day. We know that in Nelson Mandela Bay, there's a countdown to day 0 right now where old age homes don't have access to regular water that is needed for the health and welfare of residents of those old age homes. These are real challenges that need design solutions, and that's the conversation we'll be having with you today. As always, the Dutch Consul General for Cape Town, Sebastian Merschesmit, is joining us, and of course he joins me here on the couch. Big questions today. Good afternoon.
Very big questions. I'm excited to hear the professionals coming on and talking us through what we're facing.
And what sort of answers are you hoping to hear?
Well, listen, we had beautiful conversations about how to build in really good conversation with nature and how to not be detrimental to nature, but include it in your way of living in the city. And we talked about water solutions in the city. We talked about how you build the green into the city to build a blue-green city and be sustainable. But we haven't focused on health yet. And what I'm hoping to hear today is some silos being breaking down between experts of different kinds, and also some ways of how to include stakeholders from both the technical point of view, the policymakers, but also the people that are at the receiving end of everything that's being thought of and developed by smart people that are behind desks or maybe sometimes walk around and go back to desks to make new plans, laws, drawings, what have you. So the communities, the community involvement, how do you get people to feel attached to and feel involved and committed to the solutions that are being developed, because you need, in the end, everybody to also take that commitment to make sure that the solutions are sustainable, that we all keep the city healthy in our own environment, and we have our own responsibility.
And that's key, because we don't have a healthcare professional anywhere. At least I don't know that I have any healthcare professionals on my panel today. Right. So it's not about here's an intervention using medicine in order for you to feel better. It's about how do we create an environment that will, I suppose, be conducive to a healthy lifestyle.
Because it doesn't start with the end phase where you're already unhealthy and then need pills or treatment. No, it starts with the designing at the start. Like, how do you design your environment to make sure that you and me and everybody else are healthy, remain healthy, and actually can build on our health and also take care of each other?
And as always, yes, we'll be showcasing some design solutions that are already existing, but we're more interested in the process that the solutions thinkers are undergoing.
And that's why I'm really excited to hear the panel today, because you will get some people today that we're talking to us about the process. We have an urbanist, we have scientists, so I'm really curious to hear what they bring to the table of how do we tackle a problem like this. Health in the city, in a time when ESCOM is creating problems on the electricity side, in time when you had a pandemic coming in, but also in time when you have congestions in the streets with cars that are lining up and polluting it all. Like, there's so many questions are connected to your health situation in the city. I'm curious.
It's going to be an interesting conversation. Thank you very much, Sebastian. He'll join us, of course, again at the end of the afternoon. Let's now bring in the head of the Craft and Design Institute, Erica Alk, who ordinarily will be joining us on the couch. But Erica, you are going to be paying particular attention to the conversation today because you're feeling a little bit under the weather yourself. Good afternoon.
Hi, Africa. Yeah, I decided to stay at home because I have something that I don't want to pass on to anybody else.
Which is good. What are you looking forward to hearing the most this afternoon?
So I'm looking forward to, well, two things actually. The one is, I think Sebastian started to allude to it, but I think what we learned through, COVID made it sort of particularly visible, that health is not just about the health system. It actually starts way beyond that. So I'm really interested to kind of get my head around when we talk about healthy citizens, before we're dealing with problems. What does that mean? What are the ways that we can build healthy cities and citizens? And then the other is also, I suppose, it's kind of my passion, and it's the thread that I've been picking up through all of the creative exchanges, is how we get citizens to be agents of change and to really participate in the solution making, and not kind of relinquish control to the experts who are sitting or standing behind their desks, as Sebastian pointed out. So I'm sort of also keen to listen to those kinds of comments.
We cannot stress enough the importance of having the community, society, buying into whatever solution is being brought to the table. In fact, it's even more important that they be part of the designing of that solution, because you can design the most amazing city in the world. And if the citizens, the people you've designed it for, are not going to be using that city, then what's the point?
Exactly, and I think that's where design comes in. So design, and that sort of design thinking sort of process particularly takes into account the user as a kind of starting point to really understand what people need and what they want. But more than that is that I think that citizens have real intelligence. They have experience, they have perspective, so they have a different kind of expertise to bring to the table. And I think that's what we need to see, how we build processes that allow for that.
Well, Erica, I know you'll be paying attention all afternoon, so we'll chat again in about an hour and a half. And please do take care, and we'll wish you well once we chat again. And of course, the panelists that we've invited very much speak to the ethos of our conversation today. Yes, they are thinking design solutions to some everyday challenges, but they are certainly taking into consideration the health of the citizen, the community member, making sure that they're part of that solution. And I'll introduce you to them as the afternoon unfolds, but we've got the lead behavioral science consultant at 14X, Boichepo Ndlovu, who we'll be introducing you to in a moment, a researcher and biodiversity project manager, Denisha Anand, an urbanist and CEO of Our Future Cities, Rashik Fatah. But we start with a research fellow at UCT's Future Water Institute, that's Dr. Amber Abrams. And Amber, it's lovely to have you here. When we talk about blue-green cities and health and well-being, and through the lens of water-sensitive design, what is needed to create these spaces, do you think?
Sure. So stepping back from a kind of health perspective to a more well-being perspective, which is the one that I kind of approach, as I have training in public health, but not as a doctor, as a medical doctor. Stepping back to look at well-being more generally, it's important to remember that when people have agency and control in their lives, when they feel like the spaces they can move through are spaces that they've been able to cultivate and co-design, you get a lot more buy-in to generate spaces of learning and collaboration. And so for us at Future Water, when we do our interventions or when we're working in spaces, what we start with is an ethos that people are experts in their own kind of neighborhoods and situations. And we we then try to approach our research through an engaged perspective where we ask people what they'd like to see in the spaces. So for us, the blue-green infrastructures become multi-use spaces that people can exercise in. They can share lessons about biodiversity with their children. And so for us, it's about time to do that engagement, an approach that allows for that slowness, that engagement, and also a kind of perspective that doesn't necessarily look for research outputs, but understands that the momentum of getting a community together, rallying around a purpose, takes time. And so I guess one of the other things is that there does have to be enough budget that you can spend that time, right? So it's about engaging with local citizens, but also the city has to be on board. So what we propose to the city after a long co-design process has to be something that the city's willing to come to the table with as well.
And will the city or municipality be willing then to give you the luxury of not only the resources, but also time? Because when you're approaching a community of Mfuleni, for example, they'll see a PhD graduate with many, many years of studying and going, but no, you know, and not trust necessarily in what expertise they are able to bring into that environment.
So certainly a lot of our first steps of engagement are around positioning ourselves not necessarily as the experts in the spaces we're moving into, saying that we do have a little bit of knowledge and we do understand frameworks for research, but we don't know where you live, and so you have to tell us what your priorities are. And we're not always lucky that funders allow us to go with local residents' priorities. So that's another space where if the funding world were to allow us to do that, we'd have a lot more buy-in in local projects.
Rashik, at Future Cities, that's very much your approach. You've invited me to one or two focus groups where you are trying to extract information from people like us who know very little about the kind of urban design environment we want to live in, but you would find value in that, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. The idea that we can plan cities, design cities, without fully understanding somebody's lived experience is so arrogant. And so when this topic of healthy cities and healthy people came up, I always wonder if everyone really understands the 4 a.m. to 9 p.m. experience of the majority of the city and is responding to their health in every moment of that time, which is why we're so passionate about walkability to transport at 4:30 a.m., because that's when your barista gets up in the morning. That's why we're so passionate about company gardens and inner city spaces, because that's the dominant public realm experience for the majority of the city in these jobs-rich nodes. It's not necessarily Manenberg in the evening, 8 p.m. in a park, or Tafelsig cultural nodes. So when you extract these multiple narratives, and I mention that because we like our single narrative stories, this homogenous group lives this way and is this way. But in reality, if you take a neighborhood like Mittelsplein and Mfuleni, there are multiple narratives, multiple people living different lives. So lived experiences are at the center, and it's, I think, why people don't want to go there is because it's so jarring to understand how differently we live and how, for many people, our health isn't packaged into an hour at the gym or packaged into a nature experience in a park that's fenced off. So it's getting as many of those as possible, because even in areas where there are lots of complexities around violence, risks of flooding, there still are many stories, and once we can get into those, we can start to think design. We always say that you'd increase the health of the majority if you just increase the pedestrian crossing times by 25 seconds. And suddenly your risk to not just adults, but kids traveling 2 hours back and forth to school at Cape Town Station, at Belleville Interchange, suddenly your health risk decreases because of a technical engineering change. So it's everyone's lived experiences, and it's almost all the disciplines, because those step changes to health start with the smallest intervention, really.
How do you then, or what would be that sweet spot, right? Because a lot of people will see, I don't know, the MEC for health or the Maker member for health and welfare being the person who's primarily responsible for my welfare, right? How do how do you convince a town planner, a designer, a landscaper, an urbanist that actually in doing what you are designing and the solutions you're coming up with, you also need to take in consideration, I don't know, morbidity and obesity and high blood pressure and, as we saw, the pandemic of COVID-19 and now, of course, monkeypox potentially?
I think it's by articulating, using every project and moments to show how other people are thinking, living, whether it's, not to pick on the engineers, but whether it's explaining to an engineer that the reason you need a seat at an informal taxi rank is because you're going to be waiting an hour with your ShopRite bags, and it's just a different sensory, physical experience that many people go through that is difficult for others to grasp immediately. And so I'm very careful of designing solutions when we haven't demonstrated, articulated. We see the queues around blocks on pavements, people waiting for a minibus taxi. We've counted 38 seconds to cross at 8 traffic lanes at our main transport interchange. So it's that communication and research which you need to persist with and make and popularize so that it's not sort of one single department that sees it as their challenge. And I understand the challenges from within those departments, because if you're parks and recreation, you oversee fenced-off parks, ultimately. And it's hard for you to get into public health systems, which has often had very little to do with the provision of a park, and starts with extreme risks of violence and safety, and goes all the way down to, do you have time to exercise? Do you have time to access good food? So I think it's popularizing projects and ideas which make these topics sort of common conversations between everyone.
Anisha, let me bring you in now to the conversation. You are a researcher and biodiversity project manager. I imagine being able to consult with the community that you're going to have an impact on becomes an essential part of whatever solution you're designing.
Yes, everything you said is completely right. So community engagement is the first thing that we deal with when implementing projects. It's a justice. I don't think you can move into a community without ground-truthing your project ideas or your plans without proper, meaningful engagement with communities. So co-creating your conceptual frameworks, your environmental management plans, your maintenance plans, all of those things need to be ground-truth with your community. And for us, it's a justice. So working with working-class communities, working on the Cape Flats, community engagement is not just a box tick, but it's a social justice issue. Going into communities and just forcefully implementing or forcefully assuming it's wrong. It's something that's very embedded in intrusive and colonial ways of thinking in the city. So working with communities, community engagement, it's a justice issue, and it's extremely important. You can't design a city post-apartheid in a new democracy without community engagement and meaningful community engagement.
And are we finding that communities have an appreciation of this at all, where if you are coming in to come and introduce a design solution, they'll say, wait a minute, how were we consulted in this? How were we part of the solution?
Yeah, so with my experience, yes. Going to the community. So if you don't know who to approach in a community, go to churches, go to your schools, go to mosques. There's a form of leadership all over in communities, and you just need to figure that out before you start your communication. And when you take the liberty to do this, the process becomes gentle, the process becomes respectful, and there's more flow when it comes to engagement than actually sitting down. And people appreciate that, coming in and seeing people as human beings and not othering them as just participants in your plan or your city project. It means something, it makes the project human, it makes it, it centers it in justice. I think a lot of the designing in the city of Cape Town, especially in working class communities, in our former group areas needs to be centered in justice. And so people appreciate it when you sit down and have a meaningful conversation with them and share your plans with them, but then also listen to what their suggestions are, what their experiences have been in these communities, what their vision is for their community, what their vision is for their families. These are human questions and human engagement that needs to happen before you go in with a pick or with your big plans. You need to have human conversations.
But Chapa, let me bring you into the conversation. You with 14X and your world is behavioral science. We have three amazing individuals here who absolutely buy into the concept of involving communities in any design solutions. And yet, sometimes we get it wrong, don't we?
Yeah, Africa, thanks. Thank you for having me, and it's great to be a part of this conversation with some really excellent experts. I mean, yeah, I mean, in a range of other contexts, you find that, there's heavy investment in solutions. You bring the community in, you bring their involvement, which I think is great. But I mean, with this question, I like to think about what Dilip Stoneman refers to as the last mile. Dilip Stoneman, similar to me, he's a behavioral economist, and he's a researcher in the behavioral sciences. And he really, when he speaks about the last mile, he's really talking about this kind of final end stretch of some sort of completed solution or product or service where action is now required on the part of the intended beneficiaries. I really encourage, especially those who are interested in this topic and those who are on the panel, if you're really interested in understanding this kind of last mile issue, highly encourage you to get the book. It goes into a lot of detail about why this last mile challenge is such a big issue when it comes to the design or solutioning or getting products out to market. So it's really how do you get people to adopt something? Is this like digital adoption solutions? Are you trying to move people away from traditional methods of doing things? How do you get people to switch on energy saver modes where they have such tools? Or how do you get people to exercise? Someone was speaking about people using the gym or going to the gym, but it's really around how do we actually action this final stretch where you need to be actioning behavior for people. And this last mile issue really is a sort of psychological or behavioral challenge. It's got nothing to do with operations. It doesn't really care about how much you spent on building a solution or how well a solution might operate, or even that the said solution is kind of built for the benefit of others. It's about the fact that creating new behaviors or even just creating behavior change in general is very, very difficult. And there are a number of reasons for this. I could speak the whole day on this topic, but just in quick summary, as people, we prefer the status quo. We prefer doing things the way we've always done them. So we suffer a lot from inertia when it comes to behavior change. And if there really is no kind of active decision point in a particular environment or process or where something needs to happen, it just won't happen. We know that context matters a lot. Some of the earlier speakers have mentioned context, where you actually need to be speaking to the people that the solution is targeted at, where people are waking up at 12:30. Who are you actually speaking to? What is the context within which behavior is translated, right? And one of the reasons I really, really love behavioral economics, or where I fell in love with behavioral economics, is that it recognizes that as people, we're actually a bit irrational in how we make decisions or how we behave. I studied economics, classical economics, and we know that it says that we are quite rational. Our preferences are stable and static, but we know that this actually isn't the case. And a lot of my work is around understanding what are all of these drivers of behavior. So once you have built a solution, what are the sort of psychological things that might be inhibiting one's ability to do something or take part in something. Also, the action intention gap is also a very big one. As Denise has said, you might consult people and speak to the community, and people may well intend on doing things for the better, but we know that for a number of reasons, there's often this action intention gap where we actually need to think about how can we start or how can we create behaviorally informed solutions that look to
Yeah.
close this action intention gap where you might intend to want to reduce water usage or whatever, but what is actually preventing this from happening?
And those are wonderful insights. Amber, we were talking earlier before we started around how when we were counting down to day zero in Cape Town, one of the most successful elements of the project was how the citizenry of Cape Town literally changed its behavior around consumption, right? Before then, and it's bizarre to think that we're surrounded by so much water and yet we don't have enough water in the city. And we were consuming just ad nauseum. And yes, the tariffs from the city did work because now it became very expensive to consume water. But the immediate threat of, if I don't change my behavior today, in so many days I will not be able to get water out of a tap. That was an exceptional example of behavioral change on a mass scale, wasn't it?
Certainly. I mean, we were able to bring our collective consumption down by more than half, I think. Please don't quote me on that.
You're all right.
But I think that, in that context, the unknown was a driver. I'm not too sure that that's always the best driver as far as getting people really, from a well-being approach, getting people really into a process or moving change forward. For me, if we're thinking about well-being, it's about driving change from a place that is not stressful.
And are we able to maximize the golden opportunity of recent memory of a countdown to day zero? Yes, the rains have been coming and we hope for more this winter. How do we make sure that Cape Townians maintain that behavioral change and not think, well, there's enough water now, so therefore we can go splashing again?
Yeah, so I think it's about discussions, and one of the things that I've tried to drive in my work are discussions around other ways of valuing water that go beyond the monetary values. So if we're thinking about well-being, we have to think about things like spirituality. We have to think about things like being able to wash ourselves daily. We have to think about being able to take precautions in a COVID-19 context. And so what I have tried to do, and one of the things that I invite others to do, is start to discuss with people about their relationships with water that go beyond the kind of monetary values, because that gets people to start to think about or be more conscious of what they're using when they're using it. And I guess from the perspective of well-being in blue-green infrastructures or interventions, what we want is a process that allows for people to say, this is what we want to see, but also contributing to the blue-green adjustments that we need to make our cities more water sensitive. And I think that the way to do that is, as everyone else here has said, is through kind of a collaborative approach on trying to find what would be a common ground for many of us. And obviously we're never going to find one common ground, but the many stories. And the many stories approach is something that from my work at Future Water through something called the Water Museum, but also others in Cape Town. I'm seeing groups talk about water stories and bringing up their water stories. So this idea of discussion around water and its value and what it means to people, because it's not just about money.
I mean, I opened reflecting on the fact that we have stage 6 load shedding at 4 o'clock, and as exhausting as it is to think about that, we can almost function without electricity. We can never function without water.
No, so water is one of those tricky things that's really, really, really difficult to live without, impossible, in fact. But also if you've got water standing, for example, in neighborhoods that aren't getting service delivery, it's also really difficult to live with. So it's one of those really tricky spaces. If water isn't moving through our spaces in ways that can keep us well, it's also can be a challenge to our well-being as well.
Roshik, urbanists and designers are very much, I think, aware of this notion of having these blue-green city design approaches, right? I think it's not only fashionable, I think it's pretty much getting entrenched now in most design spaces. But it is this interplay between that and the health concerns that we need, and I mean, that's the focus of our conversation today. How does that interplay, do you think, have significant impact on the public and urban realm?
Well, I think, as is mentioned by the doctor, there's more to blue and green than just crisis and fear. There's well-being, there's religious practices. If you drive through most parts of Cape Town, you see different religious groups gathering at green, often wetland spaces to pray or gather. We see people performing in public realms and spaces, wanting to, like we see with the work behind us, introducing artworks because it simply develops civic pride. So we like to think of it as not purely some sort of technical engineering project, but really a human project. I wouldn't say the irony, but the reality is that some of the greenest things we could be doing are also some of the things that most neighborhoods are fighting against in South Africa and in the US and around the world. So Cape Town, like many South African cities, due to forced colonial planning and apartheid planning, has had forced urban sprawl. So most cities gradually spread out. We've had urban sprawl dictated by law and implemented very well. And so we're actually an obese city. The form of Cape Town is obese. It's not healthy, the bones, the structure. And so if we start from that premise, then mixed income, affordable, medium density housing is the greenest thing we can do in the right locations so that we travel less, live closer together, interact more, become more tolerant and integrated. So it's not necessarily just about, and then in the process, use water more efficiently, use our public spaces more efficiently, more people using more spaces, more times of the day makes it safer as well. So there are all these efficiencies which come from that. So it's sort of talking about both sides. It's that sort of that some of the greenest aspects require the Vredehooks, the Boerkaaps, the Sea Points, Kenilworth, Rondebosch. And I'm naming these neighbors because it does matter. Jobs-rich nodes, Belleville, to have well-located, medium-density, mixed-income, affordable social housing quickly and delivered at scale is the greenest thing we can do for our obese city. And then from there, I think our urban realm and our public realm becomes essential because it's such an interesting story in Cape Town. And we've just touched on some of it, but if you go from Philippi Horticultural Area, this sort of food basket in a metropolitan region, supported by water underground, which recharges generally quite well by itself. Cape Town itself is a wonderfully abundant natural city with food and green and blue. But if we get the form right as well, and we start to interweave with the bloodstream, the rivers of the city, the water, what's already there, it's a really, really positive picture, and not just one of crisis and uncertainty. And I think that's what the big brains, the scientists, academics are trying to get across to politicians is that if we get this right, it's a fantastic place for everyone to live in all neighborhoods if we can really start to develop in the right areas and not in the wrong areas and tap into all the assets of the city. And we see the assets in creativity, in arts and culture. If we really go into the blue-green assets of the city, it becomes this exceptionally abundant and resilient city which goes beyond just getting past the next crisis.
Yeah.
And there are many projects. I mean, I think there's a cycling and walking corridor from the north of Belleville down to parts of Mfuleni, which is another idea. So, but most importantly, popularizing some of these amazing ideas and projects.
You mentioned Philippi there. There's sadness about the Philippi context and dynamic is that just across the N7 is one of the most impoverished areas of Cape Town, where for 8 out of the 10 days, families there don't know where their food is going to come from. And yet, just across the highway is some of the most fertile ground in South Africa that is producing fantastic fruits and vegetables that for our own consumption, but also often for export. But back to the things that we know should be happening, but we are resistant to them. There are people who will, who've been living in Boerkaap for generations, who will tell you by bringing more development to Boerkaap or to Vredehuk or Kenilworth, you are disrupting our lives, you are bringing in elements that we don't know about, and more importantly, you are impacting on the value of our property, and therefore resistance builds.
Justice is difficult, as Tanisha says. Justice is difficult. It's difficult everywhere. People use planning regulations and laws and zoning and heritage. I'm on the Heritage Committee to defend the status quo. And the status quo is a city where apartheid is encoded in economic, cultural, social, spatial lives. So the status quo entrenches divisions and inequality. And so I think at some point it's a bit of push and pull. We have to become more sustainable, develop a variety of homes in areas that are close to jobs rapidly for more people. And I'm not sure if there's a linear or perfect engagement process for that, but I think it's definitely something that as a country and as a city, everybody should be on board with. And it's really difficult because I get it, those first 2-3 buildings are disruptive. Neighborhoods change, they start to look different, but the alternative is homogenous race-based neighborhoods of the past where we remain segregated, and it requires all the city to change. I think there's this idea that only the bad neighborhoods must get better, but it's all neighborhoods. And we've seen through the water crisis, when you map water usage per home, per neighborhood, where were the inefficiencies? Where was the high demand from? Who drives the most? Who uses the most waste? It's not in the Metro Southeast. And so the blue-green city also knows where change needs to happen, and it's not just in the so-called bad neighborhoods.
One of my favorite lines during that countdown to day zero, when people are going, how do you live on 50 liters of water? Just ask your employees, because they know. They live with less than that every day. But Chepo, let me bring you back into the conversation. You are a behavioral economist and can, I suppose, speak the most to issues of governance. Does the city of Cape Town here tell the communities of Bo-Kaap, of Vredehok, of Kenilworth, that guys, just get on with the program? We need to densify because, as Rashik and urbanists are saying, in order for us to lead a healthy city that does take into consideration the welfare of its citizens, people are going to need to live next door to you.
Sure. Look, I think the governance issue is a tricky one. I mean, I was listening to Dr. Amber, and she spoke about like financial incentives. Often, financial incentives don't last. They don't help in changing long-term behavior. They might work in the short run, but really in the long run, your governance structure really needs to ensure that it's, speaking about stories, telling good stories of others, and one of the strongest tools, in my opinion, or in my experience, is really how can you bring the social view into a sort of governance structure. I know, like the Dutch embassy, for example, really, I think just over a decade ago, came across the UK's Behavioural Insights team, and the Behavioural Insights team has a really, really nice framework on how to embed behavioural science into policy development and governance structure, such that they really do speak to driving behaviour change. I won't go into the detail of some of these things, but I think there really needs to be quite a strong awareness within governance structures just about the fact that changing behavior is kind of key to the success of these things. It's difficult. You can't go and tell people overnight that this is going to change, or you need to move or shift the way you're living. It really is around consulting, being aware of different kinds of approaches to developing governance structures, such that you are developing buy-in from the very beginning.
Let me play devil's advocate here. Let's imagine that I'm the mayor of Cape Town. I've got only until it would be 2027 in order to make an impact and ask the citizens of Cape Town to re-elect me. I don't have the luxury of time and resources. I need to get things done now.
Well, from a behavioral standpoint, for me, 7 years is a long time. The behavioral approach really is a very kind of step change thing. So what you really need to be asking yourself as the governor is, what do I, from a step change approach, what do I, in phase 1 of this project, what do I need people to be doing to ensure that I can kind of get to phase 2? So I think you need to approach it in a very chunked approach and kind of recognize that when we speak about behavior or trying to speak to a mass of people and convince people of something, you really need to start at a very granular level. and kind of break down your approach and figure out, if I need to be here in 7 years, what is it that I need to achieve tomorrow or in the next month for me to be able to kind of move to the next step. But it is difficult. But they are. I mean, South Africa, in my view, there's have a long way to go when it comes to kind of thinking differently about how we govern, or even having a behavioral approach to encouraging change. I think there's a long way to go, but there are really nice examples of how it's been done in other contexts. But as many of the speakers have said, like really involving the people, appealing to things like social norms, can go very far in assisting and building kind of governance structures that are eventually successful in driving what it is you're trying to achieve.
All right, let's get into some of the practical examples that you guys are working with at the moment. And Denisha, I'll start with you. What have been some of the main challenges that you have had to overcome in your space with some of the projects that you've been involved in? Denisha?
I am muted again. So someone was talking about that gap between intention and implementation. And I think working closely with communities, that's definitely something that becomes a problem. So when we have these intimate engagements with community, there's all this vision and these good intentions, but the drive and sustaining that drive and that vision becomes problematic. And that's something that, not problematic, that becomes a challenge. As a project manager or as a community worker or facilitator, however you see yourself, that's what I personally see myself intersecting is sustaining. So sustaining projects, sustaining vision, and hope for a space is my job. And we do this, or I've been doing this through fostering a sense of care for space and using custodianship as a concept to drive this. So Amber mentioned something, where you talk about stories, you talk about spirituality, you talk about intimate connections between water and the person, and water and your family, where you learn to swim for the first time, where you went fishing with your grandfather. What does that space look like now? Is it polluted? Can you still do that? Are there still fish? Where people were baptized for the first time. That's Princess Flair. It's where it's one of the projects that I'm driving at the moment. It's spaces where there are intimate connection, and that intimacy is where you close the gap. When you can tap into the intimacy and the care that people have for that space, that's where you close the gap. And we do that through conservation. So we use conservation as a tool, and we evolve the concept of conservation, which is simply just to care for biodiversity, and we make it community conservation. So we take something like custodianship, which just basically means to care. We take conservation, which means to care for biodiversity, and we overlap two, and you make it community conservation. And community conservation closes the gap for us with the work that we do. And it's basically going, okay, so that polluted wetland where you learned to swim, where you went fishing with your grandfather, what does it need to become that space again? And what can you as a citizen physically do in the now to get to that point again? And as a conservation practitioner, I come in and I say, well, we can do alien clearing so we can get rid of water hyacinth. How do we do that? Who are the city officials that we need to contact? I go in and we bring them to the table. We talk about, when can this be done? What was the path you walked with your grandfather when you went to go pick Willadaga or cancer bush as a medicine? What route was that? Can you still walk it? No, why can't you walk it? Litter dumping, Port Jackson. Okay, so how do we deal with that problem? So there's this intersection. So we were talking about people working in silos, and community conservation as a solution is breaking down silos. It's looking at all the issues that citizens have to create intimacy with the space, bringing those officials to the same table and saying, okay, well, how do we all fit in over here to close that gap and make it easier for a citizen to care for a space? Because that's what you want. You want someone to care for a space. It's a basic human instinct. We don't have to monetize it. We don't have to, okay, money does drive the process. We know this, it's very important. But care, tapping into something as simple as care, can close that gap. Yeah.
You make it sound all wonderful and rosy, but even I know that it's never as rosy as you make it sound right now. What are the general points of friction where you need some lubrication, basically, to make it go easier? Probably an inappropriate analogy, but you know what I mean.
So there's always conflict, you know, it's how do we, so some of the points of conflict are different communities. Someone also mentioned it earlier, you know, don't homogenize a community. Communities don't always want the same thing for a public open space. So Princess Fleur as a case study, some people actually wanted a shopping mall because they wanted the employment benefits. Some people said, no, we actually want a wetland space, and the majority ruled, and we got the wetland, and we got a heritage site, and we got a place for, you know, recreational use instead of the shopping mall. So firstly, there's community conflict. So it's easy to say, okay, let's work with one group in that community, but in the long run, that's not going to work out. It's going to cause internal conflict within that community, and at the end of the day, you're going to be the person that actually you know, got that conflict rolling. So you want to sit down and you want to hear multiple voices and the multiple narratives and the multiple visions for that space, and somehow try and get them to work together. You can have a built city and biodiversity living and working together. You just need to have a vision for that, and you need to be open to hearing, you know, what the solutions are and what the conflict is. The conflict is difficult. It's the worst space to be in when you've got all these great plans. But it's important to sit with the trouble. You know, that's what it's about. Sit with the trouble, work with the trouble, and you know, the trouble usually evolves into something beautiful, and that's what restorative justice is, and that's what we work with at the Fleur. It's a justice when you get past the conflict.
Amber, you're agreeing with a lot of what Denisha is sharing there.
I've actually worked on a project together. Sorry to cut you there.
No, go ahead.
So
the Mitchell's Plain, the retention point. I think so. Yeah, because that was one of the projects where there was a lot of, you know, one community wants this, another community organization wants this. So it's a real thing.
Yeah, so on the project that we've both worked on, the idea of conflict is if we were to have stepped away from each conflict or decided that we didn't want to sit through the conflict and see, so the idea was that we wouldn't intervene in the conflict, but that we would, like Denisha said, be the people who sustain the project as the conflict happens. Because in a moment of conflict, people might want to walk away. And so we sat through the conflict, we let people work through their own kind of, and it was very interpersonal, you know, some individuals, one-on-ones, issues with one another that tried to, in a way, derail the project. And so sitting through that process and giving space for it, not trying to solve it, not trying to be people to come in and make a solution, but see how the local residents who were already engaged with our project wanted to keep it moving, if at all, and who they wanted to keep moving forward with. So there was a lot of having to sit back. And as researchers, so I'm a social scientist on a team of engineers and water specialists and city planners and policymakers. And as the social scientist, I had to keep reminding everyone, this is not our place to come up with solutions. It's our opportunity to hold space to see where this kind of can develop. And I think Denisha spoke to that really well. I think you've also spoken to that really well. And I think it's really important to remember that as quote-unquote experts sitting here with a PhD doesn't mean that I know what someone's lived experience has been like.
But it must be frustrating,
No,
though,
not at all.
because
you have to be humble.
You know what the answer is.
You know, I don't know the engineers think, sorry, engineers. The engineers think they know the answers, and I routinely have to say, no, I'm not being fair. I'm not being fair. Some engineers think they know the answers. I routinely have to say to them, what you've engineered may solve the infiltration problem, for example. But it doesn't mean that people then aren't going to be dumping oil into that space, and now what you thought was going to be clean infiltration is oil in your aquifer. So there's the design idea, and then there's the actual use of it. And I know there's funny memes around that gap, you know, the planned design where you walk around a space and then the actual reality of a dirt path right through the middle of a space. So that space between us as experts and local residents who know their environment better than we do is a space that as experts we have to start moving with much more humility towards.
I'll ask you about the water museum in a moment, but let me bring in Rashek. What points of conflict have you had to overcome in your space and your work, and what lubrication have you used?
Many, but I think what we've learned is that we're a young democracy, and so the cultures of active citizenry is still quite new. And what that means for us is that 20-ish years in, community groups, neighborhood associations, heritage associations haven't had the same time to understand what it means to cooperate or to lobby or to not get everything you want. Because in most cases there are 10 things and we can all get 6 or 7, but we haven't yet gotten that space where you're not going to get 10, but you'll get 6 or 7. So I think there's a lot of sort of maturing of what it means to achieve spatial justice, but not get everything all the time and get a bit of progress. And so you have an cooperation. I wouldn't say it's always partnership or collaboration. Everyone always thinks of these partnerships as being sweet and wonderful. It's cooperation, give and take. And then demonstrating something, a tree, a bench, something. I think we all know in South Africa we have lots of plans, frameworks, and master plans. We don't need more of them. Deliver something, start somewhere, even if it's a tree or a bench, and then build trust over time. And I think, as has been mentioned by the panelists, the trust is not a tick box. The trust is WhatsApp. The trust is the Tafelsuk soup kitchen during the pandemic. The trust is caring, making new friends, not communicating only through singular forums, which is a town hall meeting, a workshop, very planned, very organized. People have busy lives. I can assure you, 85% of Cape Townians are not sitting at home waiting for workshops about their neighborhood. They have 2 jobs, 3 jobs. They have kids to get to school and back, and lift clubs, and judo and karate, and they have full, interesting, busy lives. And yes, we have an unemployment issue, but most people need different forms of engagement. And so demonstrate, build trust, teach cooperation, and with lots of small projects show a way forward into that bigger picture. Does this trading kiosk work, or does this one work better? Which one works best, and how do we move forward? But we're very young, and I think that's some of the issues being faced. There's been so much harm and hurt caused in the past, and it's difficult for someone, my parents, for example, to talk about District 6 and public spaces when their home used to be there. It's still a bit hard. It's still a bit new. People still want reparations. People still want real justice. So it's hard taking people into these space discussions about negotiating when they've had to for so long. But I think we have to try and teach cooperation with a bunch of smaller victories.
And yet District 6 presents such a wonderful solution, whatever that might be, when it's realized to bring a lot more people within the city bowl, and therefore walking distance of public transport, and more importantly, to places of work and to potential school as well. But one has to tread very, very sensitively, otherwise you discounting somebody's story, and that's not what we hear about. Tell me about the Water Museum.
So we keep coming back to stories, and that's what the Water Museum is about. So there was a global, so the Water Museum came out of my start at Future Water, which was in 2018 around the drought. And I was casting around for ideas because I'm really into arts-based engagements and drawing on people's other ways of communicating what's important to them, which aren't just workshops and forums, but, a story, a poem, a drawing, a mapping of their water relationships. And so the kind of water museum came out of I noticed there was a larger network of water museums around the world, but there was no representation on the African continent at all. And then last year, as we launched our water museum, there became also another water museum in Burkina Faso. So now there are 2 on the continent, but only 2. And I thought, this is a space where it's an online GPS map where people can drop in their water stories, their water relationships, arts-based renderings of their kind of watery interactions, pretty much anything around water. So we even also have collected some sense maker stories from the Water Caucus around people's experiences with their water management devices. But the idea for that map was a repository for people's varied approaches to engaging and valuing water.
And what have you gained? What have you inputted?
At the moment, we're really a young website, and we're just kind of generating understanding for what we're doing, and in various ways. So we work with some of these artists here, which I know you'll talk about shortly. We're trying to get people having discussions about their water values, the relationships, things that Denisha were talking about, like the first time you went and got baptized, and where was that, and what's your relationship to that space. But also a network where people can say, I'm having this problem in this watery space. How are other people having it? Can we connect and create a civil organization around it? It's brand new.
Yeah.
I say it's brand new. It's 2 years old, but it needs a lot of more momentum behind it. So what we're learning now are that there are hotspots of people who are willing to come forward and say, this is an issue in this space, but we don't have a really big widespread. We are learning about lots of good organizations that do water research through the map. And we invite publics to come and input their own kind of water stories or water relationships to the map.
And what's the URL?
Okay.
We'll find out.
I will, yeah.
I'm sorry, I should have warned you about that, shouldn't I?
I will definitely share that with everyone.
Rafik, you've been doing work in some wonderful places, both in Cape Town and surrounds, as well as in KZN.
Yes, I think each context presents a different set of questions. If you talk about inner city Durban, it's much more vibrant than inner city Cape Town.
Wait, what do you mean?
Much larger. It's not all doom and gloom as most people are speaking about. There are buildings which have been occupied by colleges, institutions, by small businesses. And so I think, again, it's just taught us that each place comes with their own challenges. And in each of those contexts, I mean, just if you take Belleville CBD, for example, in Cape Town, which I can assure you many people haven't been to because they don't need to use public transport. It's our busiest interchange to connect between modes. It's busier than Cape Town interchange. Again, there, how do you start to represent the cultures and faiths that are from across Africa in the public spaces, in the realm? How do you meaningfully include groups in the design of those spaces? Because despite it being the busiest, it's not the most well-maintained or managed or designed. It's not the most friendly. And so I think we've also just sort of imposed ourselves these narratives on these economic centers as being a particular way. And in Durban, there's been a lot of talk about capital flights to the north and an abandoning of the inner city. But you go to Anton Lembedi Street and you walk down 2 p.m. on a weekday, and the shops are packed from Woolworths to Nando's to Traders. The streets are busy. There are students walking around, and so how do we capture that energy of each, I suppose, each audience of each context and draw them into the solutions? Apart from what I spoke about earlier, which is how do you build in the right places? How do you not build? The best thing to do is not build at all. So if you have an inner city or an economic center with vacant spaces or buildings that are no longer fit for purpose, how do you reinvent them? How do you rehouse people, bring students back in? That's really the greenest thing you can do in those contexts, is take your formerly 25, 30-story big buildings in your economic centers, or 10 stories in some cases, change each floor into student housing, change it into social and affordable housing. So regenerate your centers with people and with a form of building and living which is for the future. Yeah. Because the best thing you can do is not build, and to adapt and use what you already have. And I'm sure all the reports will indicate that the savings in carbon emissions per capita is huge if you can repurpose an existing building compared to starting something.
But at the same time, we run the challenge of maybe and I think that's what's happening in Cape Town, quite frankly, at the moment, where far too many of the office spaces are being converted into often micro-unit residential spaces. And I'm going, how are we then going to become a residential center without any business or economy beyond a fish and chip shop and a restaurant around the corner? Do you know what I mean? Like, how do you... because as you say, we are ultimately a very, very small city, and we still need to have that sweet spot, right?
Chicken and egg, but the benefits of being located in that center, that location, is so overwhelmingly positive over time. So even if you have to residentialize it intensely with student housing, micro units, essential service workers housing, teachers, police, ambulance services, that concentration of people over time brings jobs and retail and office spaces, and there'll be a balance, but we really have a lot more to do. If you compare some of the densities, on average, there's probably about 60, 70,000 people in the city bowl of a city of 3.5 million, 4 million people. So we have a lot more work to do to bring more people in, and I think commercial space, retail space will respond to the kinds of demands. When you've got that heavy foot traffic, we all want Barcelona and Madrid, and when you've got that sort of huge demand for services and foot traffic, and we 2-3 years ago, the highest rentals per square meter of retail was at Belleville train station, not because it's the fanciest shopping mall, the largest shopping mall, because the foot traffic per hour of the day through the interchange is some of the highest in the country, the amount of people walking. And so you get into 300, 400 Rand per square meter higher than Rosebank Sandton, because people generate economy. People are the economy.
Yeah.
And people should be part of the kinds of solutions we create. And so even if we have to have a sort of big residential center, the benefits to people are going to be huge, and the benefits to our public realm will be massive, and hopefully transport becomes more viable for city authorities as well.
Well, I mean, the transport becomes very easy, but Danisha, how do we ensure biodiversity? How do we retrofit a concrete jungle like the center of Cape Town, for example, and introduce an element of life and wellness for those residents?
I think that our biodiversity is a lot more resilient than we think. And I think that, I think that there are species that are a lot more resilient, and those are the species that we need to be working with. So these spaces can definitely become stepping stones for bigger reserves and bigger public open spaces. And so use things like school grounds, church gardens, pavements. Use those verges. Use your verges instead of mowing. And we use so much of our taxpayers' money on mowing tenders. It's the most ridiculous thing in the city. We use so much money on maintaining a single species that does not necessarily belong here, which is lawn. So it's, things like turning our verges, our public open spaces, shopping malls, those little spaces into stepping stones. We call them biodiversity stepping stones. Turning them into little stepping stones, creating micro ecosystems that create these corridors for biodiversity to flow from an urban space into semi-urban rural spaces. Create corridors that link it. It's not impossible. Work with resilient species. There are so many species that thrive in polluted, disturbed, and transformed spaces. It's not impossible. It's something that we are doing in urban conservation. And these species do need care, but minimal, so it's not even a budgetary issue. It can be done. It's just to think with other species, think with biodiversity, instead of seeing it as something that doesn't live with a concrete jungle. It can thrive.
Is it the same with water? Can we retrospectively refit, if you like, a concrete jungle in design solutions that are water sensitive?
Yeah, so the project that Denisha and I are working on is doing, or trying to do exactly that. It's called Pathways to Water Resilient Cities, and it's a Danish government-funded project that's looking at taking stormwater detention ponds, so those big spaces that you often see in neighborhoods where it's just like a depression, and they're normally not wet, but when there's a big flood, they're wet for a little while, and then the water flows out. So those are stormwater detention ponds, and the aim is that the stormwater then doesn't flood our streets. But historically, those spaces have only been used for the one function, stormwater detention ponds. We've had a lovely engineer, PhD candidate working with us to find ways to make that space have more surface area for infiltration, so more space to allow for water to feed through the ground into the aquifer, but also then part of the engagement with the local residents has been, how do we then also make this space useful for you? And one of the things that emerged is that it's become a biodiversity hotspot because we've stopped the city from mowing it, because part of the infiltration process was to allow for a kind of almost, well, unintended wetland to emerge, which then local residents started telling us became a space where they heard lots of frogs and they saw more birds, where they hadn't seen birds in years. And so that space also, as a multifunctional space, is also one that we're working on adding benches to, adding shade to, making a space that's not just a kind of hole in the ground that's meant to hold water for, maybe 1 or 2 days of the year. And then the other ways are things that Denisha noted, like, the cement spaces in South Africa or in Cape Town have inherited a colonial history of canalized waterways, so where waterways were cemented to make them flow better. Well, the science has moved, the local residents have moved, everybody's moved to a space where we know that these canals actually just wash water away instead of reabsorbing them. So if we get rid of the cement and we plant them with local indigenous plants, we create biodiversity hotspots, we create spaces that people can use better, and we also create more infiltration or more water moving into like the sponge that can be our city. So water sensitive design looks for a sponge city, a city to absorb more water and keep the fresh water in the water cycle. And so these are some of the ways that we're able to do that.
And given the amount of boreholing we did in the build-up to 2018 and the day zero, we need to replace that water in the ground, don't we?
Yeah, so well, because it's all obviously boreholes. If you're lucky enough to be able to afford to sink your own borehole, you suddenly don't think of the water in the same way that everybody else is, because you've got your own tap, right, or your own access. And so the borehole sinking is a larger problem for the kind of greater water balance that we have, and it's something that is a topic that comes up a lot.
Well, we've got a few minutes left still, so if you have any questions, please use the question and answer function on the platform or the platform where you're watching and send us a question. I've already got 1 or 2, and of course, those in the audience, you also will be most welcome to ask some questions. But Bacheba, let me ask you this. What has been consistent for certainly the last 67 minutes of a conversation is that central to any of these solutions being a success will be engagement with community members and societies, and where necessary, instituting some level of individual, I suppose, behavioral change. How do we successfully see behavioral change on a macro level?
Thanks, Africa. I think, I have so many thoughts running through my head as everyone has been speaking. Behavioral change at the moment is kind of approached as a very reactive thing. So, you've spoken about day zero, where, we know that there's issues with water consumption, and it's very much how do you reactively deal with some of the challenges. And I think part of the solution there is around rethinking the design of certain things in a more proactive approach. So when you are designing some sort of water sensitive project or something around biodiversity, how can you proactively think about the end user in mind? But a lot of the stuff, as you did mention, is very individual level focus. So how do you change the behavior of like an individual who's within this green space to make use of the various, well-built features. And even though it is very individual level focused, you're speaking about communities that are full of, hundreds of thousands of people. And so the idea around behavioral change, one of the selling points is that you're making small changes, but these small changes that are individual focused on a large scale really do have macro level impact. So I think the one thing is understanding that although it's very individual level behavior focused on a large scale, and when you're speaking to a range of people within communities, that kind of has ripple effects. And so behavioral change isn't centered around sort of one-off behaviors, but one-off behaviors end up having ripple effects for a range of other issues. So where you're getting people to conserve more water or engage in healthy behavior, that it'll have ripple effects for things like health down the line, and people are able to engage more in the economy if they're healthier. So I think the one thing is that you're dealing with large scale. So even if you can create a 0.1% uplift in water conservation or recycle usage on a large scale, that has big impacts. And secondly, that there are ripple effects that single one-off behavior has for a range of other contexts.
Yeah. And who is it, for example, who's thinking, wait a minute, we can repurpose this space and use it more in this way, so therefore let me, I don't know, put in place interventions where people's thoughts and use of space is going to be changed. It's clearly not the engineers. Poor things, they've had a rough ride this afternoon, and we do know that there are engineers who are doing it well. Should it be government? Who should be leading? I suppose it depends on the project, hey?
I think leading is difficult. I think a lot of these stakeholders need to kind of complement each other in the way they put a lot of these things together. A lot of what's been discussed has been around getting the public interest, or getting views and getting people to speak about what they want and what their individual contributions are. So I think a big, like, one of the big drivers is understanding what people want. And we know from the behavioral sciences that when someone has spent time and effort into building something, we know that they value it more. So I think from a perspective of building, I think definitely the community needs to be involved, number one. But secondly, just from the perspective of changing the way we think about designing spaces, I think when we speak about governments or policymakers, I think there does need to be a bit of a mindset change in how they think about solutions being built for people. So I think the question of who should lead it is difficult. I do think that it definitely has to be a collaborative approach, and you really need to be thinking about, how do I, once something has been built, how do you get adoption and engagement right? And that's solved. It's solved in collaboration.
Thanks for that, Bashapo. We have a question from YouTube. Can meaningful engagement not be facilitated on a software platform? Roshik, shall we give that to you?
I'm not one for complicated platforms, but I think in various projects, big and small, SMS, WhatsApp has worked. People are responsive. You can form groups. I'm not promoting these platforms, whether it's Signal, Telegram, whatever you want to use. I think digital has a role to play, but I think we need to do a lot more in the physical realm to build cultures of active citizenry. If it's not been commonplace to comment on city planning documents, or to attend exhibitions to comment, or you don't have time, then I think putting it all into an app suddenly is a bit much and might not have the impact. But if there's an incentive, I think things can change. We once had this idea in Johannesburg where what do people really need? People need to get to work, and people need to feed their families and have decent childcare and health services. So possibly it's to get people to take part in a digital platform or an engagement process, you can win 1 year free Rio Vaya or bus surf, something that really matters. So you have to kind of build the cultures of taking part, and not to critique cities where they are. At the moment, for example, in Cape Town, there are 8 district planning frameworks for comment, plus an MSDF, plus we can barely keep up, and we sort of are involved in these aspects. You have to have these incentives along the way. Possibly it's a 1 year free of My City, or some kind of start to bring people in, because I think the legislation around participation, as we know and has been mentioned, is not enough. Page 9 of the Cape Argus in black and white is not enough to get somebody excited about something.
In fact, most people do that just so that they can tick a box, right?
Yeah.
Because it's required of them to consult.
Yeah,
they can say, here's an advert I placed, no one replied, but I've met my
And where are people
obligation.
engaging? What are people reading? If we talk to, in some of the buildings we work, people are playing the lottery. Which newspapers are people reading? Which platforms are there? Go to people where they are at. And try to find ways of bringing in these important discussions which people should be part of, but also need a reason to be part of. And I think people will pay attention. If I don't think we can expect everyone to catch up for 300 years of a lack of engagement, which was at no fault of an individual, but we've got to build those cultures, and some of it might be not necessarily the lottery, but in the spaces where people are, not necessarily a new digital platform.
Danisha, I imagine you would agree with that, right? Go where the people are, as opposed to introducing, Danisha is not there. Hopefully we'll be able to connect with her again so that we can say officially thank you. But Amber, you'd agree with that, yeah?
I mean, we can totally speak to the fact that if you're talking about, like Danisha was, an ethic of care, and you're talking about building trust, and you're talking about showing that care, then yes, a digital platform can be nice in bringing people together and suggesting that they share a space with you, but only once you kind of share that space and start to actually engage with people. I mean, I wouldn't trust someone that I get WhatsApps from, but I've never actually met. And so I would expect the same from everybody else, right?
Very true. Something I take for granted, and I suppose it is a featured topic of discussion on one of these dialogues. I wake up very early in the morning. I have to be up at 2:30. And by 2:45 in the morning, I'm walking from the center of town where I live to Greenpoint, where my studios are. And every day, it's not lost upon me the privilege of being able to do that. The fact that I can, as a tall man with dreadlocks and a scar on his face, walk with very little hindrance. The most, I suppose there are people who are offering me drugs, but that's another conversation altogether. But the most people who are asking for time or matches or cigarette or whatever the case may be, I don't, for my body or my property, feel any kind of insecurity. And yet that will never be the case for you. Despite, looking at innovations that we have right now, it is a very, very dangerous world for women to be living in. And that's something of wellness, right? And that's something that design solutions will also have to reflect on.
Yeah, and certainly in the project that Danisha and I were talking about, when we first moved into the space, we said, we want to plant up this space, we want a biodiversity hotspot, and residents said to us, we don't want any high verges, we don't want lots of trees, and we don't want thick bush because we can't protect ourselves then.
Yeah.
And so these are very real concerns for lots of people, women, children, and people who live in areas where there's much more violence than other spots. So it's definitely a serious concern, and one that we take really careful care to engage with when we move into spaces. Because we know we don't necessarily understand everybody else's world or life experience.
Yeah. Let me say thank you very much to all of my panelists. The conversation hopefully does not end here. We invite you please to join us on social media platforms where you reflect on how we, in dreaming up these design solutions for our built environment, we make sure that we create a space, an environment that speaks to the wellness of the citizens and the people of South Africa. So thank you once again to Dr. Amber Abrams, a research fellow at UCT's Future Water Institute, Rashik Fatah, who is an urbanist and the CEO of our Future Cities, Danisha Anand, who's a researcher and Biodiversity Project Manager, and Tupoitsepo Dlovu, who is a lead behavioral science consultant at 14X. We have made reference to the artwork numerous times, the art piece behind me. It's by Mac One. Brought together, they shared love of graffiti art and ethos. They did, along with the hand-controlled 360 graffiti art crew. They came into existence in 2017. And since then, their skills have kept growing as they learn from and share with each other. Together, they've completed many murals that bring not only color to communities, but provide thought-provoking content that touches on issues such as heritage, on sustainability, on climate change, and more. And as you heard from Amber, they're working with them in the water museum space that they are creating. Mac One is an internationally acclaimed graffiti artist living and working in Cape Town. He has been painting graffiti art since 1989. And in addition to his work bringing color to Cape Town, he runs regular workshops for learners and collaborates with a number of groups, including Heal the Hood. You can find him on your social media platforms, One Mac One. So it's O-N-E, Mac, M-A-K, and then the numerical 1. You can find him on Instagram and everywhere else, and his art is really, really amazing. Let me bring back then into the conversation Sebastian as well as Erica. You've listened for the better part of the last hour and 20 minutes. It's not easy. It really, really is not easy, but there are wonderful opportunities to be explored here, Sebastian.
Listen, we've put some quotes on the tweets, Twitter accounts of CDI, Crafts and Design Institute, and Co-Creators A&L, and myself, so people can also look back and reflect on what was said. But so much has been said, and I like how at different instances we went from the personal, where you create an interaction with the resource like water, and create the intimate space like both Amber Abrams and Denisha explained. You have to understand what the relationship is with your natural environment to come up with really good solutions. So it's not just only about including the communities, but it's also how do these communities relate to their environment. It's beautifully put together by all of the speakers, actually. And then also sometimes just a simple solution like extending the crossing time over a road. Like seriously. That you get that by talking to people. So I like how we went from the small, but also to the bigger issues, how Botsepo also said you need to get the behavioral approach into the policy making. You need to see how people behave and understand it to get to better solutions. And then also the talking to communities, like Denisha also said, is also a social justice issue. It's not just an issue that it's nice to do, but you have to include people. And it also speaks to actually South Africa today, because in the past, the society wasn't as inclusive. And so it's even more meaningful to, with a mind of coming from an apartheid and a colonial past, that today you want to be inclusive. So the design thinking method, I think, brings that. What I am curious about, having listened to all the speakers though, is we talked about experts, we talked about people going into spaces and talk to communities, but we haven't talked a lot about the policy side. Like, how does the city of Cape Town do all this now?
Because
today?
they've got 8 different little things that they're trying to get everybody.
I'm not criticizing. I'm not criticizing.
No,
but
no,
I would
no,
like
but,
to, I would like to hear the city of Cape Town saying, we do this, we don't do that. And actually, we should have them on the couch one day and like confront and talk. Policymakers.
We'll have them at the Co-Create Design Festival in September, without a doubt, and get them
I was
to answer.
hoping you would say that.
What I do not want is yet another document that
No, please.
is being published, because the policies are there, the frameworks are there. We just now need to start getting the work done.
And not only that, but also start communicating. And one other thing that Rashik pointed out, which I really liked, is also, what about the assets that are already there? The Camissa rivers that are under the city already. Those are assets that are there and they're not utilized. They're not used for the purposes where they could be used for in a healthy way. So there's so many aspects to this conversation that it's really worth listening again and getting those elements out.
Yeah, indeed. Erica, what were some of the main takeaways for you this last 80 minutes or so?
Well, just what a fascinating, interesting conversation. That was my first takeout. I think some of the, just from some of the notes that I took that struck me was about how important time and the resources are for community engagement. I think that clearly they're not a tick box exercise. If you're really serious and committed to engaging with the community. I think the other kind of very important point that coming from is the multiple narrative. Different people have different lives, different experiences, but that also means that there must be multiple solutions. And I think that
Oh, Erica, I'm going to have to do
sort of-
my radio thing, I'm afraid, and say that unfortunately your connectivity is not as strong as we'd like it to be. We were hoping it was going to be steady, but unfortunately it literally is becoming weaker and weaker. I know you've been load shed since the start of this conversation at 2 o'clock, and well done to you for keeping it present and alive. But I'm afraid we're gonna have to find a different way of getting your thoughts and reflections about what you took away here. But thank you very much for paying attention, and of course, please make sure that you feel better, so that when we gather again here in July, you are in full fitting form as always. The next event is going to be at the end of July, Sebastian. It's going to be the last of the series of dialogues before we start preparing for the Co-Create Design Festival. What, if anything, can you tell us about that event?
Actually, I was hoping for Erica to fill that in, because I know we're still brainstorming and focusing, like where do we really go? And I think that we want to take from this conversation what we heard today and the other ones to kind of build on the next one. So I don't think we've really narrowed it down to the single one theme yet.
Okay, fair enough.
Let's keep people like in tension and maybe also in tension of what's coming up.
But
Follow us.
also, I suppose, extend an invitation to say, please let us know. You've been watching and listening to a series of dialogues. We've covered a myriad of spaces really around this concept of blue-green cities. What is the aspect that you think we have left out that you really, really believe we need to focus on? It could certainly be helping us shape our last conversation, and more importantly, the festival, which sadly you won't be here for, but I imagine you'll be following intently
Do you want to go there now?
digitally.
I will follow it digitally. I will no longer be here, but there will be a new consul general here taking my place, I'm sure. So, no, let's not go there, because it's going to break my heart to leave this place.
Well, can you tell us anything about the festival?
The festival, of course, is going to be a culmination of what we've been doing in the creative exchanges so far. We're gonna use what's come out of those to really focus in the festival, talk about these same items, but also go deeper, have the workshops, do the design thinking, come up with some of the solutions, having the people at the table from the different backgrounds to see whether we can come up to the blue-green city ideas that might be workable in the future, and showcase them, maybe take them into real physical results.
And look, I said this at the beginning, I'll say it again. If we have practical solutions that we can take away from this process, great. But I think our key focus here is what is the process? What is the work that Amber, Rashid, Danisha, and Boitsepo are doing, and what lessons can we draw from there in then coming about with a solution that is going to be more impactful?
Correct, and that's exactly what we're looking for in September. So we'll see the creative minds together, different stakeholders, different perspectives, and see what we can come up with.
All right. It's hashtag Co-Create Design Festival. Do look out for details. That will be happening in in September. And of course, it will be in person as well as on a digital platform. Thank you once again to all of our panelists. And we certainly invite you to please make sure you continue the conversation around how we can design solutions for the built environment that work equally, if not better, for the welfare and the health of people. You'll notice, once again, we did not have a single doctor or a healthcare specialist on the panel, and that was purposeful because, yes, they have a space to play, and we're certainly not ignoring them, but in designing built environments, we need to be thinking about small, deliberate interventions sometimes that can actually have a much more impactful, lasting effect on not only this generation, but certainly future generations. We live in the city and in a country that is riddled with challenges, but the exciting counter to that is that we then have opportunity to come up with creative solutions that will work not only for a Cape Town context, in a South African context, but more importantly, people in the Kingdom of the Netherlands, for example, could learn from. And we often collaborate and reflect on shared experiences with them so that we can learn from them and see how we can contextualize solutions in a Cape Town or South African context. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Good luck with stage 6, and hopefully when we chat again in a month's time, that will no longer be an issue. Have a wonderful Wednesday.